Today is day 6 of the challenge to read through the New Testament in 30 days. And our reading today is going to be Mark chapters 8 through chapter 14. And within these chapters, we have all sorts of teachings by Christ revealed, all sorts of the things that were part of his ministry that are explained in such a way in Mark that they may not be explained the same way in some of the other Gospels. And so we get a great insight into Christ's ministry and into his teachings. And so I just want to touch on two things from Mark chapter 8, the first chapter we're going to be looking at today. And it begins, what I want to begin with is a passage that's found starting in verse 22 of Mark 8, where they are coming to Bethsaida and there's a blind man. And he wants Jesus to touch him and heal him. Well, Jesus does something that he doesn't do in any of his other miracles, and it's something that I believe is there so that we can take instruction from it. First of all, he uses his own saliva, and then he touches the man's eyes. And he says, "What do you see?" Well, he said, "I see people, but they look like trees walking around." Now, I don't know if this man was blind from birth and he just had an imagination as to what trees would have looked like, or if he had had his sight at an earlier part of his life so that he had a reference point to be talking about. But the point of all this is that his healing was not complete. And so Jesus, one more time, used his hands and laid his hands upon this blind man, and then he could see perfectly. Now this is a strange miracle. We don't read of any other miracle within the New Testament where it took 2 passes. Why do you think it did? Was it because this man's blindness was so severe that even Christ had to take 2 attempts before he could get it right? Was it the man's faith not being strong enough the first time, but as he was able to be encouraged by gaining some eyesight, his faith increased? Well, we really don't know. We're not told. We know it's not a fault on Christ's part. He could have healed him instantaneously the first time. But I believe this is there to show us that sometimes we need a second touch. And this is an important understanding, I believe, not only for our personal relationship with Christ, but also as we're trying to teach other people. Sometimes we try to bring the gospel to others and they don't accept it the first time, and we're very often ready to just dust our hands off and walk away and say, "Well, I tried." But some people need a second touch. And sometimes so do we. Do you remember when you first became a Christian and how devoted you were at that point? But you may have actually had your devotion wane as the years went by, so much so that you may have actually departed from the covenant of being a Christian. And then later on you came to your senses. Maybe this is what you're doing now with this reading. Maybe you're trying to come back to Christ. Maybe you realize that your life isn't what it needs to be, and so you're taking this second touch to get it right. Sometimes we need a second touch. And I believe this is what Christ is teaching us through this particular event where he healed the blind man with 2 touches. Well, there's one other passage within the 8th chapter of Mark that I think is very much worthy of our attention. The rest of the readings today are also, so be sure and go through them very carefully. But I wanted to read to you in starting in verse 34, another passage that I think has a great significance for our lives. It says in Mark chapter 8, verse 34, "He called the crowd to him along with his disciples and said, 'If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me.'" Well, now we can readily make the connection between the sacrifice that Christ made. But at this point, Christ had not made the sacrifice. These people did not know he was going to be crucified. And so this is a particularly hard teaching to hear that if we're going to follow Christ, there's going to be some sacrifices involved, maybe even sacrifices that are life-threatening. Pick up your cross and follow him. Well, he goes on to say this, "For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for me and for the gospel will save it." Jesus wants disciples who will give themselves over fully to him, regardless of how difficult it might become, regardless of the sacrifices that are called for, regardless even of personal danger from time to time. You see, people are afraid of silly things, just being embarrassed. There's a lot of people who will not own up to their belief in Christ because they're ashamed. They think that somebody may laugh at them. Or maybe they're coming out of the world, and when they're talking to their old friends who are still in the world, well, they don't want to be teased about it. And so they hide it. They do so in order to protect themselves from whatever, from a teasing, from a beating, or from worse. And Jesus just points out that becoming a Christian is a lifelong commitment. You're giving your life to him. It now belongs to him. And so you live for him. And then he says this is something for all of us. We live in a physical world and we have physical desires, especially when it comes to money. And so he says this, "What good is it for a man to gain the whole world yet forfeit his soul? Or what can a man give in exchange for his soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of him when he comes in his Father's glory." Well, think about this saying. When he says, "What can a man give in exchange for his soul?" I think we try to trade a lot of things, don't we? There are the temptations of money. There are the temptations of carnal pleasures, of sinful activities that we have no right to take part in. And sometimes people will trade their soul for these things. They'll just give themselves over to their greed or to their lusts, their passions. But you know, the odd thing is when Jesus asks, "What can a man give in exchange for his soul?" sometimes we give something we don't even like that much. Have you ever noticed how many people put their jobs first? "Oh, I would have been at the worship, but I had to work. I was behind a little bit." Or, "Yeah, I know I need to read a little bit more, but I'm very busy at work right now. I know I need to pray more, but my mind is just so filled with the work that I have." And it may be a work that's not even that satisfying to us, and yet we're exchanging our souls for something that we really don't even like that much in the first place. This is a legitimate question that we all need to be asking ourselves. What can a man give in exchange for his soul? And the answer is there is nothing that we could possibly gain, even if it was the whole world, that would be worth an eternity apart from God. And so Jesus wants us to have that perspective as we go through. Well, I thought those were two interesting lessons just from the very first chapter that we're reading today. There's 6 more after this, but again, Mark chapter 8 through 14. I think it's something that as you go through that will really increase your faith and will also make you stronger in your daily walk before God. Thank you for listening today. I hope we'll see you tomorrow. God bless.